Up to this point, we've talked about the church, basically the Protestant church, debating removing non-Aryans from ministry. It's called the Aryan paragraph. Kind of relying on you having seen some of this, but I'll give you some context if not. The Aryan paragraph was straight out of the law, like the German law, and it basically said that non-Aryans are not allowed to be a part of civil service. So they can't like work at the DMV, for example, or whatever. They just can't be a part of the government at all. And the church adopted the Aryan paragraph of the law into their confession, is what it's called, into their rules, basically, for the church, which means non-Aryans were not allowed to be pastors at first. That's where it started. It eventually moved further and further and further. First, they're not allowed to be pastors. Then they're not allowed to be a part of the church at all. And then they started what's called de-Judaizing Christianity. Like, Christianity and Judaism are obviously linked to each other. So they're trying to like remove that link, clear out any connection to Judaism that Christianity had. Of course, Judaism was the foundation of Christianity. Like, you can't have Christianity without Judaism because it's its origin myth. So they started replacing the origin stuff from Judaism. They replaced it in Christianity with this stuff about like Aryans and how, being supermen and everything else. We'll talk about the origin of Aryanism in just a second, but they're debating the Aryan paragraph right now in the church and arguing that they should not accept it, even though the majority of the church wanted the Aryan paragraph and or were fine with the Aryan paragraph being in church doctrine. There's this little section here. It had 5 points to it, is what we're reading. And it was an opinion written by, I believe, 2 scholars. And it was called the Erlangen opinion. The Erlangen opinion, I believe, is basically arguing that Jews should not be allowed to be part of the church. I'm sorry, they shouldn't be allowed to be part of the ministry, but they should be allowed to be in the church, I believe. So that's where we are in the timeline currently. Let's give this a read. Thus, the Erlangen opinion equated non-Aryan Christian applicants for the ministry with Aryans whose biological features, quote-unquote, age, gender, and physical disability, excluded them from the pastorate. So the argument is you can't exclude people from ministry based on race because Jesus said anybody who comes to me in the name of God will be saved, or whatever. Like, Christianity is based on conversion from one religion to another. How can you possibly exclude people based on what they used to be? You can't. That's like contrary to Christianity. So the racists within the church came up with the conclusion that they weren't excluding people from, let me rephrase, they weren't excluding Jews who converted from Judaism to Christianity. They weren't excluding them from being Christians. They were just limiting what they were capable of doing, how far they were capable of going, for the same reason they limit people with mental disabilities from being pastors. They're incapable because they're just not smart enough. They're inferior, basically. That's the mindset they were in. This is the next argument in line. The non-Aryan Christian was to receive the treatment that church agencies reserved for an Aryan Christian who, because of tuberculosis or a speech impediment, was considered incapable of coping with the ministry. The plea for special legal provisions, which of course emphasized the exclusionary nature of the regulation, referred primarily to clergy and office holders of Jewish or half-Jewish extraction already in office, point 7, where dismissal might damage the particular nature of the ministry and the call and ordination to it. Okay, that's a confusing sentence, but I'm sure it meant something. But even here, the Erlangen writers considered dismissal to be conceivable and justified. So dismissing people who were originally Jewish to some degree, dismissing them from Christian ministry was justified in their minds. For instance, in cases of the breakdown in the relationship of trust between pastor and congregation, despite such mitigating restrictions, the Erlangen opinion was a statement adapted to the hyper-German Volkisch zeitgeist. We should probably talk about the Volkisch zeitgeist and what it means exactly and where it came from. basically what this is saying is if the church didn't want this Jewish person to be a part of the church or to be like the pastor, then they should remove the person. Volkisch and Volk, V-O-L-K, are unique words. Volk means people or race, but it has an additional meaning behind it. Volk and Volkisch I've been using as race and racist, but it's a little bit beyond that. So let me talk about the origins. There's a guy named Houston Stewart Chamberlain. Pull up a picture of him. Here's a picture of the guy later in life, Houston Stewart Chamberlain. In the late 1800s, he, as well as like a lot of other Germans at the time, became enraptured by like Indo-European subcontinent tales. Dude even learned Sanskrit because he wanted to read these old Indian stories, these old Indian epics in their original language and context to understand them. The word Aryan originally came from like the Indo-Iranian region, although its origins were Indo-European. It was exclusively used in the like Indian/Iran region, about 400-500 BCE, so about 2,500 years ago, give or take. By that time, the word translated roughly to noble. It was like a caste system. You know, India has a caste system, social class system, where if you're really rich, then it's because you were reincarnated in that position and you deserve it. You were a really, really good person long ago. If you're a garbage man, it's because you deserve it. You did something really terrible in your past life and you deserve to be there. So the Aryan people was a social class that was at the very top, a caste that was at the top. And they were not any more like genetically unique. They weren't any more like intelligent or more evolved or whatever than anybody else. But being from a different caste, a different social class, everybody believed that they were special. Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the guy on screen here in the late 1800s, was like taken by these stories, loved them, believed they were describing his people, Indo-European people, and eventually created this whole pseudo-religious, pseudo-scientific, pseudo-historical belief system about the Aryans. Again, it's just like a class of people originally in India. And he changed that into the Aryan people are basically anybody from the European region. So that included people from Spain area before Spain existed, of course. People from France, from the Celts from like Ireland and Britain and Germanic area and the Romans. They were all included in the Aryan category in Houston Stewart Chamberlain's belief system. Nowadays, we realize that Aryan is a completely meaningless designation, like biologically meaningless. They aren't tied to each other in that way. Semitic is not a biologically useful descriptor either. The only reason that we have the word Semite or Semitic is because that's a specific language grouping. It's not a genetic grouping. There is no common origin for Semitic people. But in Houston Stewart Chamberlain's belief, again, I think he published his book. It's called The Foundations, famously, and it was published around 1899 originally. I think he published another edition in 1911. Anyway, in his book, he claimed that there were two races of people. The Aryan people, which is, you know, white people, basically. People from Rome and the Celts and the Franks and so on, the Teutons especially, and the Semites. Those are the two types of people. Semites were the eternal, immortal enemy of the Aryans in his conception of the world. In his perception, Semites were anybody from, let me pull up a map. Iran is right here, and India is right here, right? The term Aryan originated in this region right here, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and above that a little bit too, like Tibet. But its origins came from languages that were spoken in the Indo-European region. So it was broader than just India and Iran. It came from India, Iran, and up into like Ukraine, Romania, Greece, Italy, Austria, that whole area. In Houston Stewart Chamberlain's mind, this is where the Aryan people originated, right here in this region. And their eternal, immortal enemy could be found right here in the Middle East. Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Libya, these were all, and even into Africa, like the Horn of Africa and everything. It was all the Semitic people, the Jews, effectively, and they were the immortal enemies of the Aryans from here. So he believed that those are the only two real races in the world, mistakenly. And he believed that Semites, aka Jews in his mind, were genetically bad. If you had one drop of Semitic blood, again, there's no common Semitic like origin, so this is just all fictitious. One drop of Semitic blood, you were a bad person. You couldn't help but be a bad person. So he wrote this book as an addition to the Volkisch movement, Volkisch. The Volkisch movement, this racist movement, was one that believed that Aryans were supermen, effectively, that they were special, they were powerful, they were intelligent and beautiful and strong and superior in every way to the Semitic people, their enemies. The Semitic people recognized that the Aryan people were better than them, so they did everything that they could to poison the blood of the Aryan people. I mean, all this stuff is from the Volkisch movement / Houston Stewart Chamberlain's book, The Foundations. The reason that Rome fell in his mind is because they became too tolerant of the Semitic people, the Jews, and the Jews started engaging in like mixed marriage with the Romans, thus poisoning the blood of the Aryan Romans, which led to their downfall, their destruction. So that's the origin of the Aryan myth. Think if there's something else. In his book, The Foundations, I actually took notes on this because I'm writing about it at length. If you want to find it, my book is on Amazon. Look on owenmorgan.com or in the description. You should be able to find my book there on this subject. I'm not sure what I'm going to name it yet. Something Hitler related. Anyway, I took notes on Houston Stewart Chamberlain's beliefs because I'm writing about it. Let me just read some of my notes off about his book. He believed that Chinese civilization was created by the Jews. He was actually very unhappy about the fact that World War I happened because it was Aryans fighting Aryans, white people fighting white people. And that was like a travesty. They should be fighting Jews, not each other. So the point is that that's the Volkisch movement, this belief in Aryans versus Semites. By 1916, he was having nightmares that he was kidnapped by Jews and attacked or whatever, persistent nightmares that he couldn't shake. He claimed that the worship of Mammonism is evil. I had to look up what Mammonism means. Mammonism is the excessive pursuit of wealth or riches. He believes that Jews invented Mammonism. They invented capitalism because they wanted to take advantage of the Aryans. So they bring capitalism into society, and in his mind, socialism is the Aryans' method of mitigating the damage that capitalism creates. Now, socialism at the time was not what we know as socialism today. It's not synonymous with communism. Socialism is just having social programs at this time and place. Unemployment insurance, pension programs for the older people, universal health care, things like that. That was socialism in this culture. So he says that capitalism is evil, socialism was an attempt to mitigate the damages. He also believed that since Semitism, Semites, were a race, which it's not, but since he believed that, it means it's impossible to convert out of Semitism. You will always be an evil piece of trash in your heart if you have a drop of Semitic blood. In his book, The Foundations, surprisingly, he didn't advocate for the death of Jews, but he said the solution to the Jewish question would be obvious to the readers. I'm just looking here. The Teutons were kind of a tribe of people in the Germanic area long and long ago. And he had some like weird religious tie to the Teutons. Like he believed that the Teutonic Knights were something special. They were like one of the original Aryans or whatever. So he believed in Teutonic supremacy. We have very little information about the Teutons, but I believe that they were a real tribe. It just wasn't like as special as he seemed to think it was. He also believed that Jews created the Catholic Church. It says in my notes here, he believed the papacy was controlled by the Jews. Luther split off from Catholicism, thus severing Jews' religious influence. Martin Luther in 1522, or whenever it was, when he split off from Catholicism, created Protestantism. He also wrote a book called On the Jews and Their Lies. So the Volkisch movement inspired by and adopted by Houston Stewart Chamberlain heavily, kind of worshipped Martin Luther as like a God-sent prophet who was sent to expose the Semites as the evil that they are and clean out the Aryan race who was created by God to control the world. I'm sure you can kind of see the similarities between Houston Stewart Chamberlain's ideas on the Volkisch movement and the Nazi Party's ideas about Jews, right? The Nazi Party, specifically Hitler, was a Volkisch follower. He was a Volk. He would call himself that. I have a quote here from him. Hitler drew heavily for his ideas from well-known anti-Semitic tracts such as those by Houston Stewart Chamberlain, Adolf Warmond, and especially the arch-popularizer Theodor Fritsch, one of whose emphasis was the alleged sexual abuse of women by the Jews, quote unquote. Later on, a guy named Rosenberg would pick up the book, The Foundations, and run with it. And he was like a heavy influence on the Nazi Party, one of the thought leaders of the Nazi Party, basically, Rosenberg was. The book, The Foundations, sold extremely well in German society at the time. And it electrified the German people. They believed there was something special because of what he wrote in this book. They believed they were elite. They were sick of being humiliated by their defeat in World War I and sick of the humiliation by the French and by the Versailles Treaty, which was forcing them to like pay war reparations and stuff. And when they read this book, The Foundations, it inspired them to believe there's something special, the German people. When we read this book and it says non-Aryan, that's what it's referring to. It's talking about Semites, basically. And the law, German law, basically said, if you have one Jewish grandparent, you are Semitic, and you are evil at heart, and can't have any part in Aryan society at all. That's the Volkisch movement. That's what it was all about. That's how it started. That's who started it and everything. And that's what we're talking about when we say Volkisch or when we say non-Aryan. Give a little bit of context for that. Again, if you want like more information on it, check out my book on the subject, owenmorgan.com. So it says the non-Aryan Christian, so people who converted from Judaism to Christianity, or even people who had a Jewish grandparent but had been Christian their whole lives. Their parents had been Christian their whole lives, and 3 of their 4 grandparents were Christian their whole lives. Even that person could not be a part of anything, couldn't be a pastor, and eventually would be sent off to concentration camps, simply because they had 1 drop of Jewish blood. By the way, we didn't even understand genetics at the time, and they were pushing this nonsense. The non-Aryan Christian was to receive the treatment that church agencies reserved for an Aryan Christian who, because of tuberculosis or a speech impediment, was considered incapable of coping with the ministry. They're inferior, is the point here, in their minds. In addition to the Marburg and Erlangen opinions, a third independent scholarly Gutachten was sent to the National Synod, the National Assembly, basically the Church Assembly. 22 scholars, mainly New Testament specialists, sent a petition entitled New Testament and the Question of Race. At first glance, this petition appeared similar to the Marburg opinion, but the difference between the two was so pronounced that 3 of the signers withdrew their signatures in indignation 1 month later, protesting the notion that an official activity in the congregation might be subject to regulation according to membership in a voke or race. So a very small subset of people in the church basically were unhappy with the designation of Semitism as a race, and they protested, insisted that it was a religion, not a race. For the record, though, the Volkisch movement, Houston Stewart Chamberlain's ideas, had permeated German society to the core, and it was just a common belief, a common understanding. I mean, it was pseudoscientific, obviously, but that's just how it was in that society. So they didn't have a problem with the way Jews were being treated in Germany. Like, pretty much nobody, except for one guy in the church, Bonhoeffer, and maybe like 17 other pastors or so out of 18,000. Only a few people had a problem with it. Everybody else was fine with it. The real complaint, the real argument was over whether Jews can convert to Christianity in the first place and be part of the church. Anyway, let's continue. Only a few days after the Erlangen Gutachten was issued, a Gutachten is a German word that translates directly to expert opinion, by the way. So, the Erlangen expert opinion. When it was issued, the dean of the Erlangen Theological Faculty, Hermann Strathmann, raised the clearly rhetorical question, can the Evangelical Church continue to sustain persons of non-Aryan extraction in their offices? For Strathmann, the decisive factor was the reawakened Volkisch self-assurance, which regards Jewry not just as a foreign element in our midst, but also, because of its notoriously corruptive influence on the thought, will, and morale of our Volk, as a danger threatening its very nature and life. I mean, you're seeing the effect of Houston Stewart Chamberlain's beliefs here, right? That it permeated every part of the church, of society. Even the people in the church who believed that Jews should be able to convert were still Volkisch. Were still part of the racist movement, the Volkisch movement. The command to love prohibited the exclusion of non-Aryan Christians from the church. Love must overcome the inhibitions coming from Volkisch self-assurance harbored by Aryan Christians against non-Aryans. Nevertheless, Strathmann noted, nothing has been said about the admission of Christians of Jewish origin to the ministry, and a prerequisite for a fruitful ministry was that the holder of the pastorate belongs to the Volk among whom he works. Strathmann was saying, it appears, that non-Aryans should be allowed to be involved in the church to some degree. However, if the Volk, the people in his church, don't want him, then he should leave. Because it says, the holder of the pastorate belongs to the Volk among whom he works. Still, having made its bed with the non-Aryan clergy, Strathmann suggested the church now had to lie in it. Quite apart from the demand that the community of faith and love suffers and overcomes these inhibitions, that is, against non-Aryan clergy, it would contradict absolutely the command of love if the church wanted these men to atone for its own past mistake in an age of a not yet reawakened national consciousness of admitting them to the ministry. Wow, what a sentence. I gotta stop every 15 seconds and think about this. So what is this saying? Demand that the community of faith and of love suffers and overcomes these inhibitions. It would contradict absolutely the command of love if the church wanted these men to atone for its own past mistake. Okay, so I think it's saying it wouldn't be right for the church to punish Aryan or non-Aryans for just being non-Aryan. I think that's what it's saying here. Moreover, what evil really could come of it? Even from a civil Volkisch viewpoint, the further activity of these men will be tolerable, since, given past experience, there is no danger of a corruptive influence upon the Volk emanating from them. Real Pumpkin J. I would interpret that as saying that a Jewish-born Christian should pastor Jewish-born Christians and Aryan should pastor Aryans. Since most churches were predominantly Aryan, that would exclude Jewish-born pastors. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I agree, I think. I have the statistics somewhere in my notes here, and I'll be writing about it in the book. I'll include the statistics, but it was a really low number of people. It was like within tens of people, like dozens. I think depending on the category you're working with, like church musicians, for example, non-Aryans accounted for like 6 people out of millions, or out of 18,000 pastors, or like 30,000 church employees, or whatever. It was only like 6 people total. So they'd have to create one church, effectively kicking them out of the religion entirely. Anyway, let's keep reading here. Yet, this danger of a corruptive influence did exist among future applicants for church offices. In order not to endanger the effectiveness of efforts to win some for Christ, if possible, everywhere, 1 Corinthians 9:20, Strathman concluded that the church, with regard to its Jewish Christian members, must expect and ensure the greatest possible restraint with respect to entry into the offices of the church. Is this saying that, I'm not sure what this is saying. I think it's saying that Christians should be cautious about accepting Jewish Christians into the church. I mean, if there's one thing I've learned about this whole battle, it's that there were like a lot of people in the church that were desperate to ride the fence, to not take a position. And as far as the statistics that I've seen, the confessing church, the one that wanted to include non-Aryans in church business, was about 10% of the Protestant church, give or take. And the Volkisch movement within the church was actually about 6%. It was pretty small, but it was influencing the direction of the overarching ministry of the conference, because the confessing church just wanted to include people and they weren't like taking hardline stances. But the Volkisch movement within the church, like the Brown Synod, for example, anytime somebody would get up to like try to vote for something or try to give a speech, they'd shout them down. They would scream at the top of their lungs and not shut up until the people who were opposed to Hitler got down off of the podium of the lectern. They wouldn't like let people speak. They were extreme nutcases. So the Volkisch movement in the church, though it was small, guided the direction of the National Assembly. And the ones that were riding the fence, that were neither in favor of non-Aryans being part of the church nor Volkisch, were called intact churches. And they just kind of went with the flow. At its peak, somewhere around 2,000 pastors were part of the confessing church, and that's probably being generous. 2,000 out of 18,000. Somewhere in the vicinity of 800 or so pastors were full-blown Volkisch, part of the positive Christianity movement that Hitler formed out effectively. And the other 15,000 pastors or so, give or take, just followed the National Synod, the National Assembly, and it was moving toward the Volkisch direction, which means they were moving toward the Volkisch direction. Anyway, so it sounds to me like Strathman's trying to ride the line and is probably like going to end up being one of the intact church leaders. By the way, the churches at this time were gigantic. Oh my God, they were huge. The average church size was like 2,000 people or something. That's like a mega church today. The leader of the confessing church, Niemoller, his church was in a place called... Okay, I found it. Interestingly, only 8% of German Protestants subsequently embraced the more extreme, racially oriented folk religions of the 1920s. Dahlem Church, Dahlem, and it had 600 regular attendees, but it had 10 to 12,000, tithe payers, basically. They were gigantic churches. Oh my God, they were huge. Anyway, let's keep reading here. 3 weeks had passed since the Brown Synod of September 6th. Pastors and professors, by the way, that's when the Brown Synod, stood up and shouted down the people who were trying to push for, equality and inclusion. Pastors and professors had spent these weeks in meetings and discussions, writing Gutachten, or an expert opinion, and protest petitions in order to influence the decisions of the upcoming National Synod, or the National Assembly, in Wittenberg in one way or another. Yet what good could come from Wittenberg now? By walking out of the Berlin General Synod in protest, the young Reformation movement had maneuvered itself out of the Wittenberg decision. Right, when the Brown Synod started screaming at the top of their lungs so that normal people couldn't speak at this church assembly, they were humiliated, and they stepped down and they walked out. And they didn't get any delegates as a result. They had no vote, no say in the national church movement as a result. It's scumbag tactics that we see today, too, in some movements. Just screaming until you get what you want. Anyway, it says, by walking out of the Berlin General Synod in protest, the young Reformation movement had maneuvered itself out of the Wittenberg discussion. The expert opinion, the Gutachten, and other petitions were so insipid that no one expected them to lead to any essential revisions of the September 6th resolutions. There was no one in Wittenberg to make an energetic case for the Marburg opinion, which, of course, is like positive toward non-Aryans. Finally, the events of the Brown Synod had created such a stir, even abroad, that the Foreign Office had stepped in and insisted that the Aryan paragraph not be dealt with at all at Wittenberg, much less ratified in its present form. With that, the matter of the non-Aryan Christians had been temporarily put on ice. Even Bonhoeffer, who had just returned from the World Alliance meeting in Sofia, 15th to 20th of September, was unable to change anything. It was not enough. Bonhoeffer, again, is the only guy, basically, in the church, practically, that actually supported Jews because he wasn't racist, not because of some technicality about Jesus or whatever. It was not enough that 2,000 pastors had joined the first 22 signers of Bonhoeffer's petition. That's the beginning of the Confessing Church, called the Pastors' Emergency League, the predecessor to the opposition to Hitler's church, basically. It wasn't enough that 2,000 joined the 22 signers in his petition to the National Synod of the German Evangelical Church in Wittenberg. In Bonhoeffer's view, the National Synod in Wittenberg had to be forced to take a stand on the central concern of this document, the Aryan paragraph. Yeah, they all were fine with the Aryan paragraph, almost unanimously. Bonhoeffer, who hated any delay when dealing with momentous decisions, had his father's chauffeur drive him, Franz Hildebrandt, and Gertrude Stewin to the city of Luther. In the back of the car was a package of handbills to the National Synod. After Bonhoeffer had followed the ceremony from a corner of the Castle Church as an uninvited observer, he realized that Reich Bishop Muller's official report had not said a word about Bonhoeffer's petition or the Marburg and Erlangen documents, nor had Muller proposed any discussion of the Berlin General Synod. Quick side note here. Muller, Reich Bishop Muller, was a diehard Hitler supporter. His name was Ludwig Muller, and he got elected into the position of like president of the whole Protestant church conference over like 40 million people, basically 18,000 pastors. He got elected into that position basically by appealing to the Nazi Party, who then harassed the previous winner, Bodelschwing, harassed him out of the position. Bodelschwing won the election, and he was in there for 6 months, I believe, and then he resigned from the presidency of the entire national Protestant church because of mass pastor arrests, basically. They realized that, the Nazis, that is, that Bodelschwing was too high profile to arrest, so they started arresting people in his district and stuff, and kind of making implicit threats, calling his secretary at all hours of the night and leaving threats, and creating protests outside and doing radio addresses condemning him and calling him this piece of shit and everything else. And that led to his resignation and Ludwig Muller being chosen, a full-blown Nazi. However, Ludwig Muller was not chosen by Hitler. He was chosen by the church. That's been made very clear through the books that I've been reading on this subject. He was the product of the beliefs of the time, not of Hitler. In fact, Hitler was kind of annoyed with Mueller. At a certain point, they bugged his phone, Mueller's phone, and stuff. They didn't really like the guy, but he supported Hitler, and he did basically whatever Hitler wanted. So anyway, that's who Mueller is. So it basically says that Mueller had not proposed any discussion of, the Marburg or Erlangen documents, the opinions on the Aryan paragraph. Bonhoeffer did not shrink from repeating the Wittenberg sensation of 1517. 1517 is when Martin Luther split off from the Catholic Church. For Luther, the Church had sinned against the Holy Spirit through the practice of indulgences. Yeah, that was Luther's big complaint about the Catholic Church and why he split off, because priests were selling redemption, basically. If somebody died and they didn't have a chance to confess before getting hit by, a horse and buggy or something, the person's family could pay Catholic priests to pray them out of hell. And if they paid them enough, they could pray to get them to the hand of God, basically, to like the next, basically next to God in heaven. And that infuriated Luther, obviously. That's why he split off. So it says here, to Luther, the Church had sinned against the Holy Spirit through the practice of indulgences. For Bonhoeffer, it offended the Holy Spirit by the Aryan paragraph. Luther, according to tradition, had been content with a single placard on the door of the Castle Church. Yeah, Castle Church is where he famously nailed his 95 Theses, his complaints to the Catholic Church. He nailed them to the door. And that was the moment that the Protestant split was born, basically. Bonhoeffer transformed the whole street into billboards. Wow, so he started his protest there too. Interesting. He, Hildebrandt, and Stawin posted the handbills on the trees. In response, the German Christian newspaper Evangelium im Dritten Reich reported, "Impossible though it may seem, it is true. The enemy, non-Aryans, of course, Jews, the enemy is making his presence felt. Appeals without any printer's name, minutes, communiques, details, etc. are being circulated. But unerringly and surely our leaders will take steps." Inside the Wittenberg meeting, there was no mention of Bonhoeffer's action, but as Pastor Fritz Lorzer, Deputy Reich Director of the German Christians, acknowledged during the synod, this calm is the calm before the storm. German Christians, by the way, are generally the term used to refer to the Volkisch church. The confessing church were the ones that were opposed to persecuting non-Aryan Christians, and the German Christians were the ones that wanted to persecute them explicitly. And then intact church were the ones that were riding the fence. That's how it's separated. It was a calm achieved by deliberately ignoring the Aryan paragraph, whose contradiction of the confessions was not even mentioned by the regional churches outside the old Prussian Union Church. Yeah, the Prussian Union Church was very much opposed to what was happening, and was kind of the heart of a lot of protest against the non-Aryan rules. And it came to the point where Nazis basically turned it into a police state. They put it under martial law, that whole area, because of the opposition to the Aryan paragraph. Although the Lutheran regional churches of Bavaria, Württemberg, and Hanover had not yet been affected by Nazi measures, their bishops, Meiser, Worm, and Maurerens, remained silent at the synod to preserve calm. I'm not sure about Meiser, but Worm and Maurerens would eventually go on to become very important figures in this whole movement. Those two pastors specifically, I think Worm originally supported the Aryan paragraph, but as things progressed, it was a very piecemeal thing. Everything just kind of disintegrated little by little. Hitler kept pushing new rules on people and making it less acceptable to protest or argue within the church. And it came to the point where Worm just broke and said, forget it, I'm not supporting this. Mara Renz, I believe, supported non-Aryans more than Worm originally, if I remember correctly. Either way, these three pastors remained silent at the synod to preserve calm, is the bottom line. The outcome of the Wittenberg meeting, according to Bonhoeffer and Hildebrandt, was nothing less than disastrous, precisely because it had produced nothing that was not predictable. So they all saw it coming, and nobody did anything about it, and that's the worst-case scenario, basically. This silence, when protest still was possible, was to have disastrous consequences. The memory of it would be evoked 12 years later in the Stuttgart Confession of Guilt. 12 years later is when World War II would come to an end, by the way. There was no longer much readiness among Bonhoeffer's friends to treat the Aryan paragraph as a status confessionis with all the consequences. There were no resignations from the ministry. Such actions were postponed for an indefinite period. Bonhoeffer saw no chance of a credible engagement in the church within Germany. He took a position in England, deciding that it was time to go into the desert for a while, quote unquote. So Bonhoeffer basically didn't see any path forward for himself, didn't know how you fix this, doesn't know how to influence the church in a positive direction, so he left. Truthfully, I would have done the same. I think pretty much every step of the way, Bonhoeffer did the right thing. And in my opinion, at a certain point, the confessing church did the right thing too, and I don't blame them for not speaking out anymore. Like, there's a point in time where speaking out would get you killed or serious consequences. Beyond that point, I believe they should have kept their mouths shut, as many of them did, and work behind the scenes, underground, quietly, to try to alleviate the situation for non-Aryans. A lot of historians blame the confessing church for staying silent beyond a certain point. Like, after 1934, they just went silent and they didn't try to help anybody with anything. I don't blame them for that personally. I think they should have just been careful and quiet and worked to the best of their ability. Anyway, Franz Hildebrandt was determined to follow his friend, to follow Bonhoeffer into exile, basically. A few days later, in a resigned letter to Martin Niemoller, which is the head of the confessing church, one step above Bonhoeffer, he turned down an offer to work in the Pastors' Emergency League, which is a predecessor to the confessing church. But he stayed after all until Niemoller's arrest in summer of 1937. Fascinating. Yeah, Niemoller was actually a Nazi, full-blown Nazi believer, the head of the confessing church. He voted for Nazis in 1924, 1928, and 1933. He supported the Nazi Party to the core, and he supported Hitler. And the reason he was arrested in 1937 wasn't because he was opposed to what was happening or whatever necessarily. It was because he was the head of the confessing church, which was opposed to the Aryan paragraph being part of the church, and he had a meeting with Hitler. They scheduled a meeting, and he's his Fuhrer. He wants to talk to Hitler. He says, if I could just sit him down and explain what's happening to him, I know that I can just change his mind. So the meeting rolls around, meeting time. He shows up to the office where he's supposed to talk to Hitler, and Göring, Hitler's second in command, is sitting there and invites him into the room and plays a recording of Niemoller's phone call to a fellow pastor shortly before. They bugged Niemoller's phone and were listening to everything he said, and he basically made a pun about how he's going to go there and he's going to butter up Hitler. But the pun could either mean he's going to butter him up or he's going to give him a last rites, basically. So Göring plays that, and it was like a massive embarrassment. Everybody hated Niemoller after that because he kind of, if you will, screwed the pooch on that one. What a weird saying, right? Anyway, after that, Niemoller was put in prison in 1937. I believe he was put in jail for a few months and then released and put into Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Hitler was infuriated that he got out of prison and specifically told people to go pick him up and put him in a concentration camp. He was Hitler's personal prisoner, quote unquote. He's the guy, by the way, that said, first they came for the socialists and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a socialist, and they came for the social democrats, so on and so forth. That was him. When he was in the concentration camps, 1937 to 1941, he was in Sachsenhausen. And then 1941 to the end of the war, in 1945, he was in Dachau concentration camp. When he was in there, He actually, in Sachsenhausen, his first stint, he wrote a letter requesting permission to join the military, join the German Navy to fight against the Allies in World War II, fight on Hitler's behalf. He's a true believer. Additionally, when he was in the concentration camp as a special prisoner of Hitler, he was put in a little section of the concentration camp, like in a cell block, that was for privileged people, basically, like important Catholic bishops, for example, that were jailed. And his cell had a straight shot, a window to the torture cells where they brought people that they tortured for information. So Niemoller sat there day in and day out watching people get tortured and still believed in Hitler and his goals and wanted to fight on behalf of Germany and was still a true believer in Hitler all the way up to after Hitler died and he was released. It wasn't until Niemoller showed up to the concentration camp to show his family the cell that he sat in when he saw a little placard that said something like 200,000 people died here. That's the moment when he realized, oh, wow, this was really wrong. Like, bro, really? That's what it took? A plaque that said, you just sat there and watched people get tortured for 8 years. And seeing a plaque is the thing that made you realize? I'm sorry, man. I don't buy it. In my personal opinion, Niemoller was a piece of trash. I understand he was the leader of the opposition to the Aryan paragraph and all that. I don't care. He's a piece of shit. He doesn't get any slack from me. Was he tried in Nuremberg? No, he was not. They freed him from a concentration camp. And, here's the thing. Like, do you charge people for simply standing by and watching evil things happen, even if there's nothing that they could do about it? Do you charge them for at least being okay with it, even if they had no choice? I don't see how you can. It was just a belief. They did charge some people who were in the rooms and participated and cooperated in all of this, but no, Niemoller was not one of those people. He was arrested on July 1st, 1937. That's when he was sent to Sachsenhausen. On March 1938, he's tried by a special court for activities against the state, given a special or honorable detention. Okay, so he was in there for a few months. That's what I thought. Then he was sent to Sachsenhausen. Yes. And he was in Sachsenhausen for 4 years and then Dachau for 4. I'm not seeing anything about the Nuremberg trials. No, I've read a book about the Nuremberg trials. I don't believe he was tried in Nuremberg. He was a piece of trash. No respect for Niemoller. None. Bonhoeffer, decent guy. I'll give him that. He was a decent guy. He did his best. He couldn't... What else could Bonhoeffer do? Did everything he could. Did not support the genocide or even the mistreatment of the Jews. So, mad respect for Bonhoeffer, 0 for Niemoller. Him trying to join the Nazi military is a bit yikesy. Yeah, you're right. Absolutely. You're 100% correct on that one. To be fair, though, when the war started, people tried to join who did not support Hitler because they wanted to fight for the fatherland. Not for Hitler. A lot of them just wanted to fight for the fatherland. They didn't want allies to win a war against Germany either. Take that for what you will. Anyway, yeah, tell me what you think.